Hi everyone. This is the first of several lessons in which we're going to examine some important group processes, those linked to group dynamics. Focus on pages 2 and 3 in your third study guide, and there's also some important information about these group processes in chapter 5 in the text. The first that we're going to examine is referred to as the bystander effect. Perhaps you've heard it referenced as bystander apathy. In public settings, I'm talking primarily or addressing public transportation, streets, theaters, parks, and the like. People work very hard to avoid any behaviors that are going to be noticed. They try to remain as anonymous as possible. Now, if the public situation or setting and has emergency elements, what's very important for you to remember is that research notes that the more people present, the less likely anyone is to get involved. It might be illustrated in this way. Bystander apathy, or the bystander effect, caught a lot of attention when this young woman was brutally attacked by a serial rapist in 1964 on her way home from a social gathering. The assailant attacked her adjacent to her apartment complex. Although initially the press reported that perhaps upwards to 40 people heard her cries for help, later research indicated that the number was probably a little more than a handful. But it's important to remember no one came to her aid. One of the neighbors apparently did open a window and shout out, "Get away from that girl!" The assailant, thinking that perhaps the man had called the police, fled. But when the police didn't show up, he came back, he raped Kenny Genovese, and then killed her. I can remember, again, a lot of the focus in the press was on how apathetic Americans were, how particularly people living in urban settings had a "I don't give a damn" attitude. Well, as it turns out, it was much more complex than that kind of stereotype. Some contributing factors to the bystander effect are highlighted right here. On the one hand, people may actually fear that I'm going to make a bad situation that much worse. I better just hold off. Likewise, some people think that, well, there's others better qualified. As a matter of fact, some of the folks who heard Miss Genovese's cries for help made the argument, well, I thought somebody'd call the police. It's their job to take care of things like this anyway. Others argued, well, I was tired. Still others stated, well, I was just afraid. But it's important to remember that more often than not, a key factor is going to be this last point. Okay, if you've got a large number of people, everyone's really hesitant to make the first move. Everybody's looking at one another. A lot of time elapses and no one gets involved in the process. Now, as you very well know, this is not absolute, but it's an important factor to remember. Another important process that's associated with group dynamics is referred to as risky shift. Take a look again at the explanation of risky shift on the second page of your third study guide. I want you to contemplate a couple of questions. Think about a time in which you engaged in some really off-of-the-wall, risky behavior. Were you part of a group? If you were, how did the group influence your behavior? Now, if you're like me, again, I engage in a lot of risky behavior, but rarely by myself. I was more often than not in the presence of others. And an interesting illustration of this is highlighted right here. Some of you are familiar with running in a public place naked. It was a big fad some years ago, and it's sometimes called streaking. What's interesting is that it's much more common as a group activity than a strictly individual one. So sometimes when we are in the presence of others in a group situation, we're more willing to engage in, again, stronger, bolder, riskier behaviors. By way of explanation, take a look at information you will find at the top of the third page of your third study guide. On the one hand, research does suggest that in a group, there's a pressure to be different, to be bold, to be dynamic, to be dramatic, if you wish. I can recall many instances, high school, college, even middle school, when I got together with my friends and we'd start talking about things we're going to do, and someone would come up with an idea and our comment was, boring! But when someone came up with a kind of off-the-wall, unique and interesting approach, we all tended to jump on it. So there is this idea, once we get in with others, let's do something different. And if it's really clever and exciting, that makes it even more appealing. And certainly, I think you can recognize that if we go along with kind of a far out and crazy idea, it may be in the back of our minds one way by which we can win the praise and the support of others within the group. We can show them that we're in there with you, pals. But this is perhaps the most important factor, okay? Within the context of the group, you want to remember that how we think of ourselves actually becomes a part of the group. And any kind of responsibility, any kind of blame is just more or less taken over by the group itself. It's assumed not just by ourselves, but by the group. We're all in this together, right, guys? I remember countless times when, again, something we planned blew up in our face, but I assumed we were all in this together. And I was standing there going, right, guys, you're with me, right? Right? Guys, where are you? And I was more often than not left holding the bag. In the next lesson, we'll highlight another very important and extremely interesting group process. And it's referred to as group think. Later, we'll look at, again, another important set of group processes related to a well-known experiment conducted by Milgram in terms of how far will people go in terms of following instructions or orders. Until then.